Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to our second installment of our surf fishing tutorials. And in this episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about braided line, the advantages and disadvantages of it, and why we prefer braided line. So let's see how it goes. Stay tuned. So the first thing, guys, that I would like to talk about today is I would like to go through the disadvantages of braided line. And these are some of the main disadvantages that stand out to me. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the cost of braided line. When you compare it to monofilament line, braided line is literally, it can be as much as 3 times or 4 times more expensive than monofilament line. So it's a significant increase in cost, especially if you are fishing in areas where there is a lot of underwater structure and your line tends to get snagged a lot and you lose a lot of line. I mean, that happens to us a lot. And it can't be avoided actually if you are surf fishing. So at a time like that, if you have break-offs, it can get a little expensive fishing with braided line because you need to keep respooling your reel. So that's something to consider. The second thing that I want to talk about is the visibility of the line. See, braided line is very highly visible, and if you are a fish and you see the braided line, you're definitely going to know something's up. And if you have your braided line connected or tied on directly onto your lure or your rig, that could pose a problem, but there is a way around that. We'll talk about that later, but visibility is definitely one of the disadvantages in that sense. The next disadvantage that I want to speak a little bit about is the fact that braided line does not have, it's easily cut off by sharp objects. When you are surf fishing, you are definitely going to be fishing in places that have a lot of rocks and coral and things like that. And although the braided line is quite strong, it could very easily be cut by coming into contact with underwater structure. But again, this is something that can be avoided, and we'll talk a little bit about it later. So the last disadvantage of braided line that I want to discuss a little bit about is wind knots. And I know that wind knots are something really scary for first-time users or people who are new to using braid. I always hear people talking about it and being very discouraged about using braided line because of wind knots. But again, there are ways to get around this. Most of the time, 95% of the time, wind knots are caused by user error. So towards the end of the video, I'll just touch up on how you can reduce the chance of wind knots greatly. So that about wraps it up for the disadvantages. And now let's move on to the positive side of braided line. So the first thing that I really love about braided line is that it has a very thin diameter, right? So what that means is that, say you're used to using 30-pound mono, and 30-pound mono has a certain diameter. If you take the equivalent in braided line, say 30-pound braided line, you would find that the braided line, even though it has the same breaking strength, the line diameter is significantly less. So this translates into a couple of different advantages to you. First thing is you can put more line on your spool. You can fill you have more line capacity. If you are comfortable fishing with that particular breaking strength, and you are okay with, say, for example, if you can put 200 yards of 20-pound mono onto a reel, and your fishing requirement doesn't really need anything more than 200 yards, you could go up if you switch to braid, you can go up in breaking strength and still have the same capacity. So you can go from, instead of using 20-pound mono, you could like switch to 50-pound braid and have, still have 200 plus yards of line. So that gives you more muscle if you're fighting big fish. So that's one of the greatest advantages of braid that I really like, is that I am able to use a smaller reel and have more line capacity, because sometimes we are out there fishing for hours and we're carrying 10, 11 foot rods, and you don't want a heavy reel. I mean, it gets pretty cumbersome. So I generally like to fish like either a 4,500 or 5,500 size reel max, and with like the 20-pound braid which I normally use, I can easily get 300 yards of line in there, and that's usually more than enough for anything that the ocean is going to throw at me while I'm fishing. So now another advantage that you have with using braided line, because of its thinner diameter, is the casting distance. See, the thinner the line is, the further you can cast. And when you are surf fishing, a lot of times your casting distance is super important, because sometimes, depending on the location you're fishing, the fish are in close. So in times like that, you don't really have to worry. But there are certain locations that we fish where the fish are out there like 100 plus meters or 100 plus yards. So you need to be able to cast anywhere from 100 to 125 yards. And the thinner diameter of braid helps you with that. I mean, there are other things that contribute to your casting distance, like the type of rod that you use and your casting technique, the weight, all that stuff. But definitely the diameter of the line plays a big role in it. So that's a huge advantage. Also, because the line diameter is so thin, another advantage that I find is very useful is like if you are fishing a rough surf with heavy current, the thinner diameter line cuts through the water and the waves. The waves are always hitting your braided line when you're fishing. So your entire line or your rig tends to move around a lot less, because the line is now cutting through the water with much less resistance. So this is fantastic if you're fishing very rough surf or rough current. It's a great advantage. So now we come to my absolute favorite reason for choosing braided line, is that braided line has zero stretch. So that gives you phenomenal feedback to your hand when you're fishing. And now you get surf fishermen who like to cast and leave their rods out, on a rod holder and just let the rod be, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I'm the type of surf fisherman that I will cast and I'll always hold on to my rod, because the moment I get a strike or moment my weight is moving around along the bottom, hitting rocks and things like that, with the braided line, because there's zero stretch, you really get all that feedback to your hand. And I personally feel like it makes you a more effective surf angler. So the zero stretch and the feedback I find that really invaluable. It's extremely useful, especially if you're fishing heavily, areas with heavy underwater structure, right? It can help you to get out of snags. It can it can warn you in advance. You can kind of feel the weight moving around, and when it's time to pull your lead out and recast again. Sometimes with mono, there's so much stretch, there's almost zero feedback. You don't feel any of that, and before you know it, your weight has rolled into a hole or something, and it has got snagged, and the next step is you got to break your line. And the other thing is, since we always use circle hooks, the zero stretch on braided line really helps the circle hook to set itself inside the fish's mouth. You don't really have to put a lot of force into setting the hook like you would with mono. Like some guys I see fishing mono, and the way they set the hook, it's like with braid, it's just that. Just flick the wrist and you got the hook set in the corner of the fish's mouth. So that's awesome. And the last thing that I really like about braided line is the fact that we can choose. We have a variety of colors that we can choose from. See, for me personally, I like to use high-vis yellow or high-vis green, because we do a lot of night fishing. And when you're fishing in the night and you have a couple of guys casting, on your left and your right, you need to be able to see your line. And the moment you put your headlamp on and you shine it on the braided line, which has a bright color, that immediately shows you where your line is, and you can tell your buddy next to you, okay, don't cast this way, cast a little bit this way, and even when you're fighting a fish, like sometimes you fight, trevally or snappers, they swim side to side, and you know where the underwater structure is, and the moment the line starts to move left to right or towards these structures, you have a head start in kind of maneuvering the fish. You kind of have an advantage. So that's really huge, especially if you're fishing in the night. A bright color is really beneficial. Alright guys, so I hope this information was useful to you. Now, there were two things, two negatives that we spoke about earlier on in this video that I wanted to just touch on now again. One was the visibility, and the other one was the fact that braided line is more likely to get cut off on structure. Now, both of these can be avoided by using a leader, 100%. Problem solved. Right? But yeah, always guys, if you're using braided line, make sure it doesn't matter what kind of rig you're tying, always make sure that you use a leader. Another disadvantage to braid that we spoke about earlier is the fact that you can get wind knots, right? And I also mentioned that wind knots are usually 95% user error, and this is the reason, guys. You have to always avoid not to overfill your spool. Always leave a little bit of room. I've made this mistake too, in the beginning, where we fill the spool right to the edge, and that is 100% guaranteed going to give you a bird's nest after a couple of casts. The other thing that you have to make sure that you do is that any time that you cast out for whatever reason, if there's any slack in your line, don't crank the handle with that slack. What that prevents is loose coils forming around your spool. And what happens is if you don't make sure that there's tension on the line, these loose coils, the next time you cast, they're going to get pulled out by by the coils in front of it that are flying off the reel, and what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a massive bird's nest. So don't overfill your reel, and if you have slack in your line, always make sure that you reel under tension so that the line is packed tightly on your spool. Alright. Another thing that you can do to avoid or reduce wind knots is to use a good rod that has guides that are specific for braid. Right, a lot of these new K-series guides available in this in newer rods really help reduce the chance of wind knots also. So those are a few things that you need to keep in mind when you're using braid, especially the negatives. A lot of it can be avoided, and you will notice that as you keep using braid, you will get really comfortable with it. I switched to braid maybe about 10 or 12 years ago. I was using mono exclusively before that, and I can't ever see myself going back to mono, because the advantages of braid for the type of fishing that I do and my style of fishing, it's invaluable, the advantages. So guys, I hope that you found this video informative. Thank you for watching our second installment, our second tutorial. Please guys, make sure that you subscribe to our channel, and we thank you so much for the support. See you guys on the next one. Take care.